Wonderful, Professor Modi. I think you agree with me. I can sense the temperature rising in this room, both intellectually and actually physically. So if you could actually put on the AC at this light level, light. If there are protests, put them off again. I think, very frankly, I grew up in Portugal in the 1990s and 2000s. So I come from one of those, you didn't say it, but they're the pigs country, we used to be called. Portugal, the pigs country. Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. Italy sometimes, but at that point, Ireland. And for all matters we may discuss, and Portugal is actually going now through a similar process of, resurgence after the IMF bailout, where people are saying it's doing pretty well. Chinese tourists are coming in, and actually you've cooked the books to count tourism as exports, so things are looking decent. Chinese investment is coming in after President Xi Jinping just visited a month ago. But structurally, the economy is unsustainable path. You have a prime minister, the previous prime minister, actually appealed to Portuguese citizens to migrate, to leave the country. No jobs in the economy in Portugal. Please leave, he said, and we'll try our best to get you back. This is the state of politics in many of the European countries, particularly in the southern European countries. And I sense we get to sense of this in Central and Eastern Europe more and more. We'll get more of this in the future. So, of course, it'll be easy to dismiss your book as pessimistic or even antagonistic or critical of the EU. But I think in many ways we need to listen to more of your work and your research because you're doing the EU a favor. You're touching on a lot of issues which are often not discussed in open or so contentious that we like to have them behind closed doors at home and not abroad. And I think it's very important to have this discussion here in India too, given the economic importance of the EU. So Ambassador Mukherjee, speaking of India, I think no one better than you to run us through the Indian perspective on what we just heard and what this all means for India. Ambassador Mukherjee has served as the ambassador to the Netherlands and to the UNESCO in Paris. She's followed Europe pretty much for 15 years non-stop, I think, including as Joint Secretary for Europe West, dealing with the European Union and many of the Western European countries. She's authored most recently an excellent book on India in the EU, An Inside's View, which gives, I think, a good personal and institutional account of her experience in dealing with the European Union and the European economies since the 1990s. I believe you were in 2000 in Lisbon, actually, is that right? When the first EU-India strategic partnership and summit happened in Lisbon in 2000. We've come a long way, or maybe not, so I welcome your thoughts on what this all means for India.
Well, thank you very much, Tino, and I must say it was a very interesting account. I can now understand actually why you asked me to be here today, because the book which I have written on Insider Perspective actually puts on record my firm conviction that Europe is not in decline, that it would be a great mistake for the international community, for the United States, and for India to think it is in decline, that Europe has come out of the difficulties which I have dealt with in great detail, including about the Eurozone in my book, because in my book I try to deal with institutions of the European Union which are very poorly understood in India. Because although we are a federal government, as you rightly pointed out, we are not an intrastate institution, and therefore many Indians do not even understand the internal complexities of the European Union. In doing so, I also dealt in great detail with the possibility of a Grexit and what went wrong during the meltdown of the banks and how did Europe come out of it. So let me first begin by making a couple of points straight away as from my perspective, which is that if you go from the opposite thesis that Europe is not in decline and that the euro was a good idea, then you have to look at what actually the German Chancellor said. He said that when countries have a common currency, they don't go to war with each other. That is actually what he said, the German Chancellor, when he agreed to this euro, leaving aside the beloved Deutschmark. And why did he say that? It is very important to also understand the achievements of the European Union. It came out of centuries of war, and after the Second World War, the manner in which Germany and France approached each other, reconciled politically, reconciled in a manner which is an example to many of us here in India, actually, and then built up a great intra-state institution where they tried to do away with the nation state. Now the point is that for many people, including in India or in the United States, where nation state is very important for us in India, because we've come out of colonialism. 190 years of colonialism was not a good time for India, 190 years of colonialism. But we have to understand what that giving up of nationalism actually meant in terms of political compromises to the Europeans. They also had very vibrant nation states. Sovereignty meant a lot to them. Giving up core competencies to Brussels was not easy. Having a common currency was not easy. And why should Germany in any case be blamed if Germany said, directly or indirectly, that Germany would not pay for the debts of other countries? Today in India, where we are a federal country, 2/3 of our revenues, Professor, go to the states. 1/3 stays with the center. In other words, we have decentralized after the Modi government to a very large extent the manner in which we send revenues. Now, the states, therefore, are now much more decentralized. So you would find many strong, highly developed southern states are giving up a lot of their revenues to weaker states like Bihar, for instance. And there is discussion, there is debate, because it is obviously normal, whether in a federation or in an intra-state entity, that a country that is doing economically very well naturally would feel that it is unfair for it to perpetually fund the excesses of another state. And so, when the Greek problem occurred, the Greeks themselves acknowledged that it was due to bad economic policy and political failures of many Greek governments. In fact, I would say that the Greeks let themselves down, because it is not true that the European Central Bank did not try to help. The Europeans tried to build up a firewall, and in fact, India also contributed, it was in the time of Dr. Manmohan Singh, to the firewall. The problem was that people expected that very rich Greeks outside Greece, including many of them living in the United States, would come to the rescue of Greece, would buy Greek bonds, etc. Well, that didn't work. So that was one of the tragedies of the entire Greek crisis, that Greeks themselves living outside Greece did not come to Greece's help. So why blame Germany for it? And the point is that when you're in a currency union, and that is exactly the whole issue that our center had recently with the Reserve Bank of India. When you have a strong bank which has certain policies, and then you have a center which is looking at the federation like it is in India. So in the European Central Bank, obviously it's not going to devalue the euro just because one or two countries are not doing well. So that was my first point. The other point is that, yes, it is true that as far as trade is concerned, one of the main problems that many developed EU countries have is that they do too much of intra-EU trade. They should diversify their trade and try to find trading partners outside Europe. Those who have done so, Germany for example, have done much better. The Dutch are now trying to do that. So if you do too much trade between yourselves and one part of the zone is not doing well, you also get trapped into the same kind of problem. Then as far as the example which was made about Italy and about high fashion costs, etc. Well, I'd like to just say that from an Indian perspective, you cannot expect a highly developed economic zone to compete in labor costs with developing countries or LDCs. It is for that reason that, for instance, in India, the garments market has gone down because Indian labor costs have risen. Indian labor is paid 10 times more than Bangladeshi labor. And Bangladesh gets concessions because it is a least developed country, although for the last 5 years, its GDP growth is much higher than India's. So under those circumstances, the bottom has been knocked out of the Indian garments industry. We find we're no longer competitive as far as prices are concerned because of the problem we have with Bangladesh. The same is true for, much more true for a highly developed economic zone like the European Union. You cannot expect the Italian fashion worker to accept the kind of in fact, you cannot. He would take his state to the European Court of Justice. There are so many other rights inbuilt into it. But there's much more to it than just that. The point is that what the European Union is famous for, whether it's Italy or it's France or Netherlands, where I served for 3 years as ambassador, is that they have very high-end goods. The world economy cannot just survive on cheap textiles. It has very high-end goods. It's not true that there's no R&D. There is R&D. The Dutch, for example, are at the upper end of the scale for so many industries where Americans cannot compete with them. So I think it is extremely unfair to write off the entire European Union zone as a country which is not able to compete because of high labor costs, where there is no investment on R&D. That could apply to India. We need to apply much more. We need to invest as we grow faster. We are doing that. We need to put much more into R&D. But I don't think it applies to the European Union at all. Of course, it is not for me to defend the European Union. I see a lot of my European Union friends sitting in the room. But, well, I think you guys need to give me a medal then. Okay, my final point is that on Greece, I do want to say one thing, that for Greece, what was a problem which the EU needs to ponder about is that the EU did not show sufficient generosity when the Greek economy was being downsized so rapidly that Greeks, this is a developed country, very important, in a very strategic area of the European Union, when there were so many cuts on their pensions that people could not have money to buy their medication for high blood pressure or sugar, that they were far worse off in actual terms than people in India. That is when I felt that when the World Bank and the IMF urged the EU to write off much of Greece's debt, and I've written about it in my book, that it was clear that Greece, with debt at 220% of GDP, cannot pay off its debt in the next 100 years. That it is clear that if there had not been a Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe when Europe was devastated after World War II, then Europe too should show generosity and should have pulled Greece out of its crisis much earlier. They did not do so. Actually, in my perspective, as a very strong supporter of the EU, damaged the perspective of people like us living here in India about the generosity of the European Union to one of its own. So if they cannot show generosity to one of its own, then you can't expect them to show generosity to somebody outside the Union. So that was a very important point that has been made in this book that I've only read, I'm heard about. I need to read it. And finally, there are issues on which the European Union now needs to understand, as this book has said, that things have really changed in the world. Perhaps a normative foreign policy based just on soft power is now not enough for the needs of the Eurozone, particularly if Brexit actually does take place. Under those circumstances, if they want to have a strong strategic partnership with India, for instance, they have to understand that with India's course of history, colonial rule, the problem of 1962, a very difficult neighborhood, India looks for military strength and hard power in its strategic partners. That's the reason why India looks at United States, because United States, as I've written in my book, is a revisionist power which revises the rules of the game each time to suit India's requirements. That's what the United States did for the India-US civil nuclear agreement. That's what United States did to get India into the NSG. That is what United States did when it gave us the waiver under CAATSA. So when Europeans ask me, EU asks me, why is India having this love affair with USA? I tell them, you have to ask yourself the question. You need to have a vibrant common foreign and security policy. You need to have the European Union ambassador needs to have a defense attaché in Delhi. I've said that on several occasions. You need to understand that in your strategic partners, if they require hard power, then you have to give them hard power. Because maybe your strategic partner understood that when it was a soft power, the world did not listen and we lost our territory. I'll stop there and then I'm sure there'll be questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Mukherjee, I think particularly on hard power, not only military and security power, but also the importance of economic openness and flexibility towards what the EU has been pursuing for more than 10 years now, which is a freer, fairer, now they say, trade and investment liberalization agreement with the EU, with India. But I'd say that more than military and security, that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point, that for this relationship to become more robust, I think the importance of economic openness and interdependence is going to become crucial. Whether it's between Europe and India or even Australia and India, I'd say any relevant power today. Military, security, soft power, normative alignment, all are very nice and good, but they have their limitations. In the end, what the rise of China has taught us is that following 30 years of purely economic entanglement between China and East Asia and its neighborhood, China is now converting that economic interdependence into political security, any type of leverage, which is natural. Same thing the US did with the German Marshall Plan and Europe post-World War II. There's nothing particularly malign about what the Chinese are doing, but that's certainly the lesson we should be looking at as we try to build stronger relationships which hold into the future. So let's make this, let's rise the temperature even more in this room, and let's get, I think we've opened a window or something. It feels a bit fresher to me now. I don't know, maybe because of your comments, which are more optimistic. But let's open this up to a debate. We have around 20, let's say we started 5 to 10 minutes late, so we have 25 minutes. Let's aim to end at 5:40. Let me start with Mr. Berry, maybe, and then we'll follow 3 questions.
Let me declare, firstly, that Ashoka and I have known each other in many of the phases of his career, the World Bank, the Woodrow Wilson School, Bruegel as well. So, Ashoka, I'll focus on the economics, but I'm approaching it a bit more from Ambassador's perspective. And of course, Ambassador was in The Hague when I was there with Shell. So, look, let me, and with apologies to other people, to the non-economists in the room, you know that countries in Latin America, for example, have opted for dollarization on occasion. And they opt for dollarization for a reason, and the reason is to acquire stability and credibility, point number 1. Point number 2 is that the decision to join the euro was a sovereign act by each one of these countries. I forget where in the Twitter sphere, now that there's the 20th anniversary, I read this, but somebody involved with the project at that time, and of course people will be looking for excuses, said, look, for Europe, what was important was that you couldn't have, if you like, floating exchange rates and the single market. So that was the perception. So I'm making the point that these were voluntary choices by sovereign governments. And indeed, there was a lot of debate about whether Greece should be allowed to enter. Fast forward to who has been the beneficiary. People argue that Germany has been the beneficiary. You didn't actually, address that. Martin Wolf in his FT column talked about the fact that adjustment has been externalized, which is therefore why what is going on in the Eurozone continues to be of global importance. Why am I making these points? I'm making these points for 2 reasons. One is that the story has not...
Sir, we have a longer list of questions, please.
The story has not ended, and any fixed exchange rate system will be tested politically. So I see what is going on as a political test, and as you yourself have admitted, essentially, you know, it's not going to be possible to unscramble this this dish. Secondly, you know, Italy in particular, what does one make of the Berlusconi years? Okay, is that endogenous or is that exogenous? In the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Monsieur.
Thank you. My name is Simon Horenberger. I am from the French Embassy, and I have two comments to do. Was Euro a tragedy for Europe? I don't think so. I don't think that. Was Euro a tragedy for the EU? I don't think so. And I know there is many scholars, especially Anglo-Saxon scholars, who thought that the euro would fail. And what I just see is that 20 years after, it is still a strong currency, and it resisted to the worst financial crisis since 1929. Now, what is true in terms of economic theory is that when you create a monetary zone, a monetary union, you have many advantages like more transparency, more transactions, a better business environment, but this does not bring automatically more convergence. That's true. But I think that now the Europeans have understood that, and you have had a very important decision taken by Germany and France a few months ago, that is to say, to create a budget for the Eurozone in order to support more convergence within the Eurozone. And this is, in terms of macroeconomy, a breakthrough. Then is the EU divided? I think we live in a world where many things are divided. The UNSC is divided, WTO is divided, Asia is divided. If we look at our countries, we can say that they are divided. But what is important is to look at, does the institutions work, and are we able to take decisions, think of the future, implement new policies? And when I look at the EU, this is functioning. I will give you 3 examples. First of all, in terms of migration, the EU took decisions, and now the level of illegal border crossings in the EU are the same as before 2015. And the EU is about to create a European border and coast guard. If you take the field of defense industry, the EU is setting up a European defense fund, which for Europeans is conceptually a breakthrough. And if you look at what the EU is doing in the world, it is still engaging more and more other partners. Let me take the example of Japan, a country whose economy was not fully open for decades. And Japan wanted and managed to have a comprehensive economic partnership with the EU that has been voted by the European Parliament very recently. So I think that we have challenges, and I do not underestimate them, but the EU is still functioning, and I think that many governments within the EU realize that this is a good scale, a good framework to face today's challenges.
Next, can we get, in the interest of gender balance, any lady? I'll give priority. There, please, young and perfect. And then we'll come to you, sir.
Just to introduce myself, I'm Shreya Deora from the Economist Intelligence Unit. Thanks for using one of our covers. That's actually one of my favorite magazine covers too. Yes, Europe Savior. But I couldn't help but notice that when in your presentation you talk a lot about certain European economies. But the fact is that the Eurozone and the EU is a lot more than just Germany or Italy or France. I suspect that there must be something more to the EU model if there are still countries with the wish and, that wish to still join the European Union, that still wish to, join the Eurozone. So I feel like maybe we're discounting the model a little too harshly right now based on the performance of some of the larger economies. For instance, the economies who joined much later, like the Baltics, for instance, have done really well under the Eurozone. So I would just like to know your thoughts about that.
So shall we continue? You want to take these three? There's lots of questions. Yeah, as you wish.
So take a couple of comments, and because there's a theme over here, and so maybe what I can do is give a first response to that theme, and then we take an. I'll be brief.
Good.
So take two.
Okay.
Take two more comments.
General Chopra.
Okay, I'm basically a combat veteran, 4 wars, but I have some idea of economy because I was chief with Tatas for about 10 years. Okay, I have 2 issues to be flagged, and being a soldier, I'll make them short. You talked about Brexit, and you talked about sovereignty. Now, I want to know this business of what's happening in the headlines if they leave European Union. Since you talked about economic opportunities, what are the opportunities for us? And number 2, this business of UK sticking to the pound. Were they wise that they did not join the divisive euro, as you have said? If you could comment on that. And my second issue is sovereignty. Actually, this harping on the core issue of sovereignty is overdoing it, because universally, sovereignty is something that everybody is possessing and wants to carry on. Even with the UK, if Theresa May loses the second Brexit plan of hers, UK is, according to me, going to become a vassal state of the European Union. They'll be bound into the European Union, and I can't see any benefits coming from them. So could you comment on these 2, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have Hari Odari, Embassy of Nepal.
Thank you, Tino, and thank you, Professor Modi, Modi and Ambassador Mukherjee. I mean, I've not read the book, frankly, and I hope I'm not the only one not to do so over here. So, but plan to. Professor, you highlighted many, based on your talk anyway, you highlighted many things that's not working in Eurozone. You talked about economic disparity, you talked about the instruments that are not working, and based on the R&D figure, you said that the things are not going in the right direction for the future. But there is the other part of the story as well. There are many things that are working. I mean, just to join what my French colleague said. The rule of law, that's working in most of the European countries. Democratic institutions, they are working. Governance, quality of governance, that's working. I mean, social safety nets. So there are many things that the rest of the world looks with a kind of respect when it comes to Europe and how things are there in Europe. So is it not a kind of overreaction, the kind of conclusion that you have reached, the pessimistic conclusion? So is it not, are we not in such a, I mean, is it not too hasty to say that things are falling apart? Thank you.
Look, let me just make 2 comments. Number 1, that European nations continue to be very important and nations that European nations are both important and worth looking up to. There are a lot that is praiseworthy and a lot that is worth emulating. The European project itself is a wise project. It responds to the need of centuries of war, and when Robert Schuman declared on May 9, 1950 that Europe needs to come together to create what we today call the European Union. It was a gesture of goodwill and reconciliation. It led to the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which is Europe's most magnificent achievement. Open borders, created prosperity. Not taking away any of that. Okay, so let's put that to the side. The question is, where does the euro belong? So compare the Treaty of Rome to the euro. The Treaty of Rome stops at the border, creates virtually no claim on national sovereignty. The euro claims a huge degree of national sovereignty. It enters into the core sovereign powers of a nation, which is to tax and spend. Response to the general's comment, that was Maggie Thatcher's most important reason to reject the euro. She says that if I give up the right to tax and spend, I am giving up a core sovereign authority. And I'm not willing to do that. She was right on the economics, she was right on the politics. Maggie Thatcher is much reviled figure in Europe because of her views, especially on the euro, but she was 100% right on the euro. The fact that Britain stayed out of Europe, I would say 9 out of 10 Britishers say thank God for that. So I'm not claiming that Europe is fundamentally a bad idea. It's the euro impinges on sovereignty. The euro also does one other thing that the Treaty of Rome did not do. The Treaty of Rome, all partners are equal. In the language of Bob Cohen, a political scientist at Princeton, it creates an international organization that is based on mutual trust and reciprocity. The euro, by contrast, creates an international organization that's based on hierarchical structures. It necessarily, by definition, makes some nations more equal than others. And you saw that in the Greek crisis, where the German chancellor, for a period of 3 or 4 years, de facto became European chancellor. I'm not making a normative statement. I'm making a descriptive statement. There was no decision that was taken between the period of the Greek program starting in April 2010 to somewhere in the range of 2013. Chancellor Merkel made all the most important decisions. She needed to, because there's no other authority. That is what created the political friction. So, euro impinges on sovereignty. It impinges on, it makes some nations more equal than others. And therefore, sows the seeds of division. I see also, in respect to the comments my French friend here made, says, by the way, I'm a person without borders at this point. In America, I'm an Indian, of Indian origin. In India, I'm a non-resident Indian. And in Europe, I'm an Anglo-Saxon. No, in Europe, I'm an Anglo-Saxon. Because anytime you say something against Europe and you live in America, you become an Anglo-Saxon. So the picture that I see, and this is in response to a number of comments, given the sort of the standards of living of Europeans, you're not going to see a dramatic collapse. What you see in the language of Jared Diamond in his book Collapse is what he calls a creeping normalcy. The phrase creeping normalcy says that the weakening of the system occurs at a gradual pace. So he has many metaphors. One of them is deforestation. He says deforestation is not obvious when it is occurring. You see it over a period of time, the erosion of the forest. And then there are, as you say, there are counter forces. He says there are saplings that grow back. And you say, well, the deforestation has been reversed. Here you see some saplings, here you see some saplings. But he says that the overall process of deforestation occurs in a relentless way. What I am seeing, and the decline that I talk about Europe is sort of, I'm not completely sure what is the counter to that, but in school education, in university education, in research, I mean, the evidence is relatively sort of solid. Just a minor example. A student of mine, who is perhaps the best student I've ever had, when she applied for scholarships, she did not apply for Rhodes Scholarship. She applied for the Schwarzman Scholarship, which is a scholarship at Tsinghua University. Because the brightest kids all want to go to China today, not to Europe. That is where they see the future. Chancellor Merkel herself, in a 2010 Royal Society speech, said, if we don't watch out, China will soon reclaim the preeminent position that it had in the 10th century. So you have the tragedy over here is that it was already in the process of great nations that inevitably go through a period of decline because the old models do not last forever, and the political ability to transform radically is hard. There's nothing unique about an economy and society declining over time. Every society does that. But what the euro did was it superimposed on an already declining system a set of frictions and divisions that are both economically and politically hastening that process. I'm just going to quickly answer Suman's question. Suman, the answer to your question is here. Sorry, I can't move back. Okay, so the question you're asking is, and the lady here also asked a similar question about some countries. There's a proposition in economics called the external anchor theory. What does that say? It says that I believe that my government is incapable of delivering good governance. And therefore, I'm going to tie my fortunes to a currency of a country that behaves responsibly. And because I'm tying myself to the currency of a responsible economy, like it or not, my politicians will also be forced to behave in a disciplined way. In Italian, and if there is an Italian in this room, will forgive my pronunciation, they call it vincolo esterno. Vincolo esterno means that there's an external constraint that is placed on me. That was the basis of the Maastricht Treaty. Mario Draghi, according to a very respected scholar, says vincolo esterno was in his soul. The problem is that, as you rightly say, Suman, the periods of fixed exchange rate are short. The currency board in Argentina lasted all of 4 or 5 years before it crashed. If you look at the history of fixed exchange rate systems, other than Hong Kong, they rarely last because the notion of an external constraint can work at best for a couple of years. The reason I wanted to show you again the Italian chart is this, that, I'm sorry, I'm not.
Go back.
What was Draghi's proposition? Draghi's proposition was that if the exchange rate is fixed, the Italian productivity growth will go up. That is the essence of vincolo esterno. Because if productivity does not go up, then the fixing of the exchange rate has achieved nothing. But he did not allow for the possibility that it may not go up. And it didn't, it in fact fell. And because it falls and you cannot also have an exchange rate depreciation, then the proposition that it may do so counts for nothing. The Baltics is a good story. The Baltics is a good story not because the euro worked. The Baltics were relatively poor European countries with a very sound human capital base. A Polish worker is as productive as an Italian worker and gets half the wage rate. Therefore, there's enormous catch-up potential. The Baltics are riding on a convergence process that has nothing to do with the euro. That's a basic natural convergence process that's going on. Poor countries with highly endowed human capital, perhaps amongst the best in the world, will catch up because they have been left behind for half a century under socialist planning. That catch-up process will continue till it runs out. It's nothing to do with the euro.
Except they've opted for it.
Thank you. Why? Shall we go over
The fact that they've opted for it is a bigger story, and we have to think about it. So let me just defer to him and allow a few more questions. But we cannot allow the possibility that an external anchor can work over an extended period of time.
Thank you. So let's do this. Let's do a quick rapid fire, and then we'll give the speaker discussant 2-3 minutes to finish it off, because it's Friday. Probably everyone wants to enjoy the weekend. So I'll follow the order, except I'll use the gender prerogative of giving the first. There's only one lady, so Sophie, first to you.
Hi, Sophia from the British High Commission. Given the events this week, I thought it might be good just to come back on the Britain point. First of all, there were a couple of people that have suggested that the UK may not leave the EU. It might not happen. I can assure you it will. We are committed to leaving the EU and doing so in an orderly way, i.e. with a deal. It's a difficult process, as you might have seen this week, but we are working through that. And I think it's fair to say, in terms of the opportunities, there are lots for both India and also our European partners, because whilst we're leaving the EU and not leaving Europe, so I think just those 2 points are quite important to remember when we talk about Europe, UK, Brexit. That's it.
Thank you. In the back.
Yeah, my name is Shashank. I'm a student at the Hebrew University. My question is to the ambassador. She spoke about Europe's future being in the common foreign and security policy. My question is that there's a lot of divergence if we track from last year with respect to the PESCO and the Euro Army, and there doesn't seem to be any respite from that. It is bound to be a long-haul process. And considering the environment right now, do you think, like with the current political environment, it might not necessarily translate into votes on the ground, so those fortunes can change. So I want to know if you meant for the long haul or immediately, and your comment on that. Thank you.
Christoph?
Yes, hello. Christoph Meilenburg from the Austrian Embassy. I just have two very short remarks. The first remark goes to the lecture of Ambassador Mukherjee and her mentioning of the need of being generous in the Greek crisis. Obviously, we can discuss that, but if you compare it to the Marshall Plan, I think the basis, there are two things that cannot keep compared, and let us not forget, although we are all extremely thankful for the Marshall Plan, but let us not forget that generosity was not the biggest motive behind the Marshall Plan. There was a Cold War going on, and of course the most important motive was to keep the devastated countries out of the communist sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. So I guess that was not there in the Greek crisis, and so one could not have expected the same so-called the same excuse of generosity in this case. And the other remark that came to my mind just when the professor mentioned the vinculo, what was it? Vinculo, yeah. I mean, there are also positive examples because the Austrian National Bank pegged the Austrian currency schilling to the German Deutschmark very soon after the end of the Second World War. I don't know exactly when it was, but it was a huge success story until all of us, Germany and Austria, entered the Eurozone. But obviously, the Austrian and the German economy were extremely similar, and so. But that was an example where it definitely worked.
Peter, you have a question. So let's Peter, you first, and then we'll go to the last question.
Thank you, Peter Rimmele, Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Let me just bring another quote of a famous European. I don't share your pessimism. Jean Monnet saying, European Union is not a product, it's a process. The process is going on. And I would have a question referring to Brexit. Most economists are saying Britain is still sort of fighting reality. Would you think that Brexit could bring a new vitality to the remainders? Remainders, I mean the other 28, in seeing it's better to do things together, because likely, and according to prediction of most economists, Britain will not do better alone.
Okay, last we'll go to Dhruva Jaishankar, my colleague.
Dhruva from Brookings, India. Professor Modi, your book seems to be dealing with the counterfactual, which in some ways, or at least that's what's behind your presentation, which is what if the euro had not happened? And you assume that that would have perhaps been better, and I think you make a very convincing case sometimes for some of the problems. However, have you taken into account what the costs would have been, at least the cost of friction, within the European Union if there had been 20 plus separate currencies? And secondly, did you take into account, did you consider, would the Deutschmark or the French franc have been able to compete in a basket of global currencies for reserve versus the dollar versus a rising renminbi in the absence of a euro?
This great discussion. Sahil, come on, you're my colleague, so I cannot deny you the question, or I won't enjoy my weekend.
Thank you, Sahil from Brookings. I work in energy. Fantastic comments. I have two questions, one for Professor and one from the Ambassador. In several ways for European nations, there are two crises of sovereignty, one that you've clearly outlined, but what's different in terms of they have their hand tied at the back, they can't really invest in stimulus or anything of that sort, and there's almost a religiosity around austerity. It's basically the fundamental pillar on which the project rests. So, but what's different now? What I perceive as being different now is that EU in itself is at loggerheads with its premier ally in the recent past. It's been the US, and it's now trying to, as you clearly showed, it's in recessions, trying to reorganize its trade and investment and all these relationships, and it's facing a pushback to the extent that there is a, vast amount of, there's a lot of recrimination going on, and that's also a kind of an assault on the EU that's being launched at, it's just at the, just in terms of how the foreign policy is being conducted in general. And that's leading even to a greater, within the populace of the EU, even a greater kind of despondency. And what, for example, Tino mentioned, that Portuguese people, for example, feel despondent. The Portuguese leaders feel like, you should migrate. That's basically because you can't really do much in their own. So is this the difference this time, like forging of ties with the Iran and the Russian, the issues that have come in the recent past? Is that amongst the last final straws, things that we didn't really see that were happening in the past that are happening now? And then question to the ambassador is, you spoke about soft power and the fact that EU cannot project that kind of security, I mean, that function of security. And there's been talk lately of a European army, right? So my question is that when Macron, kind of the new leader, is trying to project that the need for a European army. So with NATO already there, who are these army going to defend? Army people going to defend? And that's basically the two questions.
Okay, let's aim to get out of here before 6, and it's been a very good discussion. I think we're very glad and lucky to have Professor Modi here and Ambassador Mukherjee. So let's give them both the last words. Ambassador Mukherjee, up to you first.
Thank you very much. Since I didn't have comments in the first round, let me quickly say that there was a young man from Nepal, I think, who talked about the many things which EU has, many achievements. And I'd like to underline that in this EU experiment, some of the things which they have, which compare very favorably with the United States, since I'm not an Anglo-Saxon, I'm an Indian and a Europhile and strong Europhile. Healthcare, for instance, it's amazing what EU has as compared to United States. Security of pensions, social security net. And then, you said that education is declining. Actually, where I was ambassador, Netherlands, they have amazing educational institutions. So does Germany. And I would actually say that there has been a strong decline of educational institutions in United Kingdom, unfortunately, ever since the British government decided to reduce public funding for UK, which has actually resulted in Indian students deciding not to go to UK and to go to Australia and to US. So that was the first point I wanted to make. The second point was that there were several questions raised about common foreign and security policy, European army, NATO, etc., and Brexit. So I'm going to combine the two. I'm going to say, first of all, that from a purely Indian perspective, but also from a European Union perspective, what held back the European Union in moving forward on the common foreign and security policy persistently at every point was the United Kingdom, which saw the German-French efforts to move forward on a European army and a common foreign and security policy as a threat to the transatlantic alliance, to which at that time they were deeply committed. Don't forget, President Trump came much later, right? So that was a very important point. Now, with President Trump telling the Europeans to pay for NATO, etc., forgetting that when you don't pay, you lose influence. That's something Trump will find out, right? So the Europeans, without the UK, will probably move much faster on a European army and a common foreign and security policy, which will also serve to reassure allies like India, which presently depend upon individual EU countries like France, Germany, etc., for military support, exchange, defense imports, to go in for a much stronger military defense relationship. As far as Brexit and India is concerned, our position as India has always been that the EU is our largest trading partner. We will trade with the EU with or without the UK, with or without Brexit. We are not at all affected unless the UK leaves the EU without a deal. If the UK leaves EU without a deal, EU then becomes rudderless in the WTO, where it is a member of WTO, but its trading arrangements are through the European Union. Therefore, in the ultimate analysis, if there is no deal, then UK and India, like UK with the European Union, will have to forge individual trading arrangements, which from the Indian context are not expected to be easy, given that the present Conservative government in the UK have come down quite harshly on migration, movement of people, etc., things which are of great interest to us and on which we've always got a much better deal from the European Union without UK. So if you're going to have a good deal with the UK, we would push them on these issues where there would naturally be a backlash from their side because they have a very conservative part of the Conservative Party, If there's a general election, that's a different matter. So at present, we are prepared to trade with the EU as EU and with the UK as UK. And we would continue to do so. If there is no deal, it would affect UK, it would affect EU, it would affect India, and it would affect the rest of the world, which also includes Anglo-Saxons and the US. I'll leave it there.
Professor, 9 minutes.
Yeah, I don't need 9 minutes. So there are two questions. One is a somewhat technical question, which I'll deal with first, and then there are sort of the broader questions that you raised. Yes, in principle, there is a counterfactual running through the book. The counterfactual is not an economic counterfactual. The counterfactual is a political counterfactual, which is that what the euro does is it creates ties that bind too tightly. That's my key point. And that therefore, because it creates ties that bind too tightly, one country's problems become everyone's problems. If Italy had a lira and had an exchange rate crisis, Italy would have an exchange rate crisis. What's new about that? Today, if Italy has a crisis, it brings down the Eurozone with it, and it brings down potentially the world economy with it. That is the counterfactual. Maybe Italy will not have a crisis, but the possibility that that happens is really the counterfactual. So how would Germany have done? German Deutschmark would have appreciated. But remember, the German Deutschmark appreciated from 1970 to 2000 also. The Germans upgraded their product quality. That's it. In fact, the fact that the German Deutschmark has not appreciated is in some sense an unfortunate occurrence for Germany, because the Germans have not been put under more pressure to innovate and overcome the appreciation of the Deutschmark. It has created a global problem in terms of the imbalances. Therefore, from a political point of view, a system of national currencies would have been a preferable system in my view. We come back to your point on Brexit. I'm steering clear of Brexit today because I have very controversial views also on Brexit. But the notion that a Europe without Britain is more cohesive. So taking the example of defense, in 1953, in the wake of the original Steel and Community Agreement, there was a big push to create something called a European Defense Community. European Defense Community created a European army. More importantly, it created a European budget to support that European army. The European Defense Community, up until today, is the most far-reaching effort to create something that has the look and feel of a United States of Europe ever attempted. The Germans, seeking legitimacy from the rest of the world and from Europe, even though placed in an inferior position, German soldiers would be placed in an inferior position in the European army. Chancellor Adenauer accepted that because he craved political legitimacy. Who rejected the European Defense Community? The French. In August 1954, the French National Assembly rejected to a round of applause the European Defense Community because the Prime Minister at the time said there is too much integration in the European Defense Community. This was the shadow of the war, because it is the most propitious moment to overcome sovereignty. That is the most propitious moment. As the shadow has receded, the notion that Europeans will give up their sovereignty, which they were unwilling to do when the memory of the war still haunted them, in my mind, is a historically blinkered view. Jean Monnet, like the saviors, is one of the European saints who is quoted more often than he deserves to be quoted. The notion that Europe is a process, I understand that. I was on a panel with Jean-Claude Trichet, the former European Central Bank president, some 2 months ago. He pats me on the back and says, Ashok, you know, there's a long history over here. We will get there. Maybe they will. I don't know. But I'm telling you, the only forecast I can make is that the euro will continue to amplify economic divergence, and the economic divergence is a necessary consequence of the euro, and the more it amplifies economic divergence, the more it deepens political divisions. The ability to overcome that divergence and division requires an ever greater political commitment. And I'm therefore arguing that at a time when European nations are declining nations, when even Germany today is at the risk of becoming a second-tier global power, the willingness of German nationals to say that we will be generous to other European countries, already having demonstrated an unwillingness to do that for the last quarter century, that sense of generosity or lack of it is now being embedded in the political process with the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland party. The Alternative for Deutschland will never become a ruling party, I hope, but it will create a break on the German political process in terms of any willingness to create a generosity towards Europe. Chancellor Merkel's own Christian Democratic Union is riven with divisions between people who are willing to and unwilling to support Europe. The rhetoric will always, from a German rhetoric, will always be, we want more Europe is good. Germans have not completely forgotten their history, and therefore the rhetoric will always be that. But it will always be great idea, but not now. That's essentially what the Germans have done. I'm not taking away the achievements. Look, I am saying that there is a creeping erosion over here which undermines this fabric over time, weakens it, and there will come a moment when an Italian crisis could tear that fabric apart. That is the thesis of the book. That there is a structural process over here with one country that remains just to emphasize Italy. Italy is 8 times the size of Greece. Italian sovereign debt is the same size as German sovereign debt. Italian banking assets are about the same size as German banking assets. Therefore, a country that does not grow for 20 years and has no clear short-term prospect of growing will remain a financially vulnerable country into the foreseeable future, embedded in a system that is creates structural disadvantages for it. That's the tragedy. That's basically what I'm talking about. You can say, I'm not taking away any of the good stuff of Europe, the healthcare and all that. I would love to have that. But that does not therefore negate that on all matters of defense, on migration, on rule of law, there are simmering differences in Europe. and to ignore those differences and to ignore the fact that the euro overlays on that a further structural divergence, I think would be a mistake. That's the story.
Thank you, Professor Modi. 3 requests in the last 30 seconds of this Friday. First one is to enjoy your weekend, and that's an easy one. And please come back to Brookings India as we continue working on Europe and having these, I think, very important discussions on Europe, the European Union, and how that affects and shapes India's future economic, political, security interests. I think it's a rising debate in Delhi. I think it's about time that we have now a nice group of people who are working on these issues, and it's also good to have people from abroad coming and sharing their work. The second request is to please buy Professor Modi's book. It's available on Kindle, on Amazon, and it's on Kindle, it's on Amazon. I think the Indian edition will be out later on this year, but this edition is actually up for sale. And I think I've only gone halfway through the book, but I've learned a lot. It's a deep, well-researched book. I think it deserves all the attention you can get to understand the economic dimension of the EU integration process, its opportunities and its perils, like we saw today. And finally, please join me in thanking both the speakers here today, and hope to see them here back at Brookings at some point. Thank you, Professor Modi.